A former pastor, now sex offender, who many said got a sweet deal to avoid jail time for sexually abusing a minor, is back in custody. This video is per Action News 5 in Memphis. Lindsey Whiteside's seemingly good fortune in state court does not appear to be carrying over to the federal charges she now faces. What helped her in her state case were letters from community members vouching for her, but now some of those people who stood by this sexual predator's side are taking back what they said. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. All right, guys, before we get into this case, I want to take a moment and talk about our sponsor, this app, Upside. It's pretty great because it gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas and groceries. Upside is easy, it's free. I use it a lot when I pump gas, go to a convenience store, or hit up a fast food place like Taco Bell. And we are talking about real cash back. So after you spend, money shows up in your Upside account, then you just transfer it straight to your bank. So here's what we do. Download the Upside app, it's free. You buy whatever you plan to, you pay like you typically would, debit or credit card, then you file a claim in the app and you get money back. So to find out how much you could save with Upside, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on our screen and use promo code OTC to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. You might remember this story when a Mississippi district attorney went scorched earth last month. And I'm not over exaggerating. I'll show you that in just a moment. This was after a former youth pastor and high school basketball coach received probation in a case where she admitted to sexually abusing a minor. It seemed like the predator in this case actually lucked out, but we've learned her legal saga is far from over.
This sentence is an absolute abomination of justice. It is not right. It is everything that's wrong. This is the reason why people question whether our institutions actually serve victims. This is the wrong message. It is very, very difficult for a victim of a crime, especially a child, to come forward and then to have her voice silenced by a horrible, horrible sentence, miscarriage of justice. Makes it even more difficult for future victims to want to come forward and be brave. I want to commend the victim in this case and her family. I've rarely seen such a display of courage and faith, and I consider it one of the privileges and honors of my career so far to have represented them in this process. I'm very disappointed that we did not get a result that I think was appropriate, but I am very proud that our victim did what she was supposed to, and that was speak up for herself. And even though we did not get the result we wanted, that will never be taken away. Lindsey Whiteside will have to register for the rest of her life as a child sex offender, which will hopefully be a mark to show society that she's the worst type of menace that can never be trusted.
That was the DeSoto County District Attorney not holding back in that news conference after what many thought was a sentence that let a sexual predator off the hook last month. And now we have some new information on this case as Lindsey Whiteside, the suspect, is once again behind bars, and she does not appear to be leaving anytime soon. Now, I'll talk about why this is happening in just a moment, but before we get there, let's talk about how we got to this point and what exactly led up to this. It begins with Lindsey Whiteside. She is from DeSoto County, Mississippi, which is just over the state line from Tennessee, south of Memphis. And Whiteside, that is a name that has appeared to carry a lot of weight in DeSoto County. In fact, the prosecutor on her case said that there were judges that had to recuse themselves in state court because they had relationships with Whiteside's family. Now, also take a look at this picture, her jersey hanging on the wall where she played high school basketball. Now, prosecutors say that Whiteside started abusing a young girl in a church youth group that she led in the spring of 2024, and that abuse went on for months. Now, when investigators got involved later that year, they found 64,000 pages of text messages and handwritten letters on church stationery showing Whiteside's relationship with this teenager. I'll have more on that in a moment. Now, Lindsey Whiteside played college basketball at Lipscomb University. Here's her picture on the school's website. She was also a girls basketball coach at DeSoto Central High School. Not only did she have access to kids there, but she also worked at a local church, Get Well Church in Hernando, Mississippi. It's a Baptist church where she was the student and outreach coordinator. In the words of prosecutors, she used the gospel as a weapon.
She was trusted with a congregation, she was trusted with children, and she betrayed that trust. She used the gospel of Jesus Christ as a weapon. She used the vulnerabilities of a child who was going through personal struggles to gain access and manipulate an entire congregation, but even worse and more specifically, she manipulated a family through a undeniable pattern of abuse that started with several months of grooming and then several months of prolonged and repeated sexual abuse in the worst type of manner. I cannot summarize the entirety of this abuse in a short press conference. Suffice it to say, I sincerely believe that if this was perpetrated by a man against a young woman, that we would have seen something akin to 20 years in prison.
Now you'll see why that district attorney was just so angry in just a moment, and we are getting that video from ABC 24 in Memphis. This state investigation into Whiteside began in November of last year. The district attorney says that there was someone who came forward with information that Whiteside was sexually abusing an underage girl in that youth group at a church. So it turned out that Whiteside was sexually abusing and grooming that child as far back as May of last year, and the abuse went on into the fall. When law enforcement started investigating, they found incriminating text messages. In fact, again, 64,000 pages of text messages between Whiteside and this victim. They also have written letters they say are incriminating, in part because the letters were written on paper with the Get Well Church logo on them. The district attorney said they had Whiteside dead to rights, that she would not have stood a chance at trial. Whiteside pleaded guilty to sexual battery of a minor. Now here's an image of Whiteside in court for her sentencing in that state case, according to WREG-TV. They say that the victim, who's now 18 years old, also testified at this sentencing hearing, that victim gave emotional statements about the impact that all of this has had on her life. Prosecutors wanted Whiteside to be put in prison for the maximum sentence of 30 years. The judge had other plans. The judge sentenced Whiteside to 3 years house arrest and 7 years supervision. She would have to register as a sex offender for the rest of her life, but she would not have to spend a day in prison. Now here's the DA's reaction to that.
This sentence is an absolute abomination of justice. It is not right. It is everything is wrong. This is the reason why people question whether our institutions actually serve victims. This is the wrong message. It is very, very difficult for a victim of a crime, especially a child, to come forward and then to have her voice silenced by a horrible, horrible sentence, miscarriage of justice. Makes it even more difficult for future victims to want to come forward and be brave. I want to commend the victim in this case and her family. I've rarely seen such a display of courage and faith, and I consider it one of the privileges and honors of my career so far to have represented them in this process. I'm very disappointed that we did not get a result that I think was appropriate, but I am very proud that our victim did what she was supposed to, and that was speak up for herself. And even though we did not get the result we wanted, that will never be taken away. Lindsey Whiteside will have to register for the rest of her life as a child sex offender, which will hopefully be a mark to show society that she's the worst type of menace that can never be trusted.
Now, when I say the DA went scorched earth, he was calling a lot of people out, beyond just the judge. He brought up the fact that there were multiple judges that had to recuse themselves, he says, in this case because they had ties to Whiteside's family. And he called out several people from Whiteside's church who showed up in court in support of her, even though she was pleading guilty to having sex with an underage victim, a girl in the youth group at that church. The DA says that Whiteside got off the hook.
I actually saw the defendant looking relieved. I heard some rumblings from her side of the room where they were actually very happy. This is exactly what they asked for. So they are very happy because she will get to go to the same restaurants that you and your families go to. She will continue to have access to people's kids, and she will live her life as she always does as long as she registers.
When that verdict came down, you talked about disappointment. Was there anger or rage as well?
So I typically don't criticize a choice that a judge makes, and I certainly would never criticize a jury. In this case, we have a judge that acknowledged great harm being done to the victim and then essentially did nothing about it. And so it would be it'd be a little self-serving for me to pretend like I don't have a little rage or anger. I certainly do. I think the broader problem is the implication a sentence like this has on the community, because you can't. How are you going to trust a system that lays down for a perpetrator like this? So I know we had a question here and then there. Okay. Yes.
In your capacity as a DA, can you ask for a sentence review to see if you can be handed a harsher sentence?
So we do not have the option for any type of appeals or sentence reviews. When a circuit judge makes a decision, that's just a decision. That's why elections are so important, because voters are the only person or the only people that have any sort of oversight on a circuit judge. The best I can do, and it's a little early for me to really be able to give any indication whether it would help, but I do plan on taking my case file and the transcripts to the federal prosecutors, letting them know what a horrible miscarriage of justice this was, and see if, based on the fact that she crossed multiple state lines to do this type of offense in other jurisdictions, if we may be able to get her prosecuted through a neighboring jurisdiction or maybe our partners in the federal government. I will certainly do everything I can to advocate for my victim, no matter what juncture of the proceedings we are. I can't personally prosecute or appeal anything, but I will certainly appeal to prosecutors in other jurisdictions, share evidence, and plead for them to pick this up so that hopefully she'll be properly punished. Let me go over here real quick.
I just wanted to ask, we were supposed to start at 1, was there anything in the courtroom that held it up longer than the intended time?
I think maybe there were more people coming in than were maybe expected, and so they're giving some time for that to settle off. Judge wanted to address the media about certain rules for recording before we began. We did not bring the victim or her family into the courtroom until after the judge had a chance to make that address, and so there were a few little housekeeping things that slowed us down, but that's about it.
If you could sit down in a room with Ms. Whiteside, what would you say to her?
I think she's such a narcissistic, manipulative person that there's probably nothing I could say that would even register with her. As we stood there today, she was making excuses for herself. She was downplaying what she did. I don't think she fully even gets it. She is so self-absorbed that speaking to her would only fuel her own desire for attention. She wants to be special. She wants to have attention from a congregation or social media or whatever, but she's not special. She's just a child predator. She is notorious at best, and she will not be remembered for her father's legacy. She will not be remembered for any contributions her family made to education. She will be remembered for what she is, and that is a child sexual predator.
Now, that is how Whiteside's state case played out. Then the federal authorities got involved. Roughly 2 weeks after her state case was over, Whiteside was hit with a federal indictment. According to the new indictment, Whiteside is accused of transporting a minor across 3 state lines, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia, to commit sex crimes. And prosecutors say the victim was just 14 years old when the abuse began. A second count involves similar conduct crossing state lines, and a third alleges that from May to November 2024, Whiteside used a facility or means of interstate commerce to persuade, induce, entice, and coerce a minor into sexual activity. Whiteside has pleaded not guilty to those federal charges. This is video of Whiteside appearing in court per Action News 5 in Memphis. During a 4-hour hearing this week, a judge revoked Whiteside's bond. She's now in federal custody. Whiteside had been at her mom's house since Halloween. The TV station reported that her attorney argued that not only has Whiteside followed the rules of bond conditions since she was hit with these federal charges and has lived at her mom's house, she showed up to court. Her attorney also argued that Whiteside and the victim had a, quote, relationship that was not predatory. The judge said that she was, quote, troubled by that argument. Prosecutors have argued that Whiteside groomed this victim. Now, Whiteside is going to be behind bars until her federal trial, and that isn't slated to start until February of next year. Now, there is another development that we're following in this case, and it's related to those letters of support. In fact, there were roughly 50 of them written by community members ahead of Whiteside's state sentencing in support of her. The DeSoto County District Attorney, who's the same man who openly criticized and called out the people who wrote the letters in support of Whiteside to get a, quote, favorable sentence, has now filed a second motion to have Whiteside resentenced in the state case. The DA has submitted 2 letters from people who were once supporters of Whiteside. One is from a 19-year-old who said her sister is best friends with Whiteside, and she writes, quote, "I even found myself believing that she might be innocent because of the things she would say. And, quote, hearing the evidence that came out of court made me sick. I can't believe that I believed her story and all that had been told to me by her," end quote. Now, the second letter, written by someone who is taking back their support for Whiteside, also appears to be a teenager who was in the youth group at Get Well Church. He wrote that he was sorry for writing the letter. He said that he had believed what Lindsey had told him, that she was innocent. He then says that when she pleaded guilty and he heard the evidence at trial, he wanted to take back that letter of support. Whiteside's federal trial is slated to begin February of 2026, and she will be behind bars in federal custody until then. Joining us now, an attorney for sexual abuse survivors, Stacey Benson. Thank you for being with us on Law and Crime to talk about this case that's kind of had a few legal twists and turns since Lindsey Whiteside received a sentence in her state case. She's now facing federal charges. But when you look at what she pled guilty to, and now what she's accused of in this federal case, just what stands out to you about her as a defendant, as someone who is a convicted sexual offender related to the state case that she pled guilty to?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. You know, from what the DA has said, I've watched a lot of this and followed the coverage of this story, and it seems to me that Lindsey Whiteside doesn't have really much of an understanding of the crime she committed and the harm that she will and has already caused this victim. Sexual abuse has a lifelong impact on the child following them into adulthood. And, you know, categorizing this as a relationship, as she has done and as her attorney has done, is completely deplorable. It's a crime against a child, and that's what should be used as the definition of what happened here. And this is something she needs to be held accountable for. She's a child sexual predator. She's pleaded guilty. Granted, she made calculated strategic decisions, and she groomed and sexually abused this child, and doesn't appear to have any remorse for her actions, and instead tries to justify them with excuses for what she did.
And I'm sure you see this a lot in your work, but you know, her defense attorney in this federal case, and is you know, professionally he's doing his best for his client, that's his job, but to be in court and to make the argument that this was actually, Judge, it was a sexual relationship between two people. And that was actually something, it seems from just what we understand from people in the courtroom, that was something the judge, just in her words, it was troubling that he would even make that argument. And certainly on the outside, you're just, after everything we've read in the state case, you're just shocked that that would even be categorized or characterized as a relationship. I guess, how often is that argument by attorneys actually brought forward into court?
It is unfortunately something that we hear often, both from the predator and from the defense attorneys. And, you know, like you said, these attorneys are trying to do their job and advocate for their clients. But in this situation, to justify a predator's illegal actions and quantify this as a relationship is normal. It's normal in this arena of law, but let's not get this confused, because a relationship is something, it's between two consenting people. This isn't, a relationship is not something that happens between a trusted adult and someone in a trusted position of authority, like a pastor, a coach. It was a calculated crime. It was grooming, and she sexually abused this child on an ongoing, repeated basis for several months. And I think one of the, if not the victim's mother, one of the adults in the courtroom said, a minor cannot consent. And that is 100% true. And that's exactly what we have here in this situation. This child could not consent to an adult relationship with a person who's nearly 10 years older than her.
And in her state case, there was a lot of controversy over the sentence that she received. The prosecution went in, they wanted the maximum, I believe it would have been 30 years in prison, but the judge decided 3 years of house arrest and then 7 years of supervised release on that. She would have to, and has registered, I believe, as a sex offender for the rest of her life, but not a day in prison. And I feel like this isn't the first case we've seen with a young person guilty of a crime like this that doesn't seem to get prison time, and there's controversy surrounding it. What do you see just with, I guess first with what she received as a sentence and why it seems that sometimes judges go in this direction as opposed to having someone spend time behind bars?
Well, first, I think her sentence was a miscarriage of justice. Whiteside was an opportunistic person. She was methodical in carrying out these horrific crimes against this child. Unfortunately, we do see inconsistencies with how the court handles child predators, and that's not something we should condone in our society. We need consistency. Child sexual abuse is one of the worst crimes a person can commit, regardless of the predator's gender, their age, their race. My understanding is that she also had Whiteside had a tremendous amount of support from the community, family, former friends, colleagues. Letters of support were submitted on her behalf, including from school board members. And it's likely some of this did help sway the judge in how he decided to sentence her. I don't know the connections her family has, whether or not that was with the bench or law enforcement. And yes, she does have to register as a sex offender, and that will be with her entire life. But she is a child predator. She should not be allowed in society. She shouldn't be able to roam free with minimal repercussions, like no prison time. And I guess from my perspective, it's disappointing to say the least. And the judges that we elect, whether it's in Mississippi or Tennessee or Minnesota or Georgia, they need to ensure that our justice is served in our communities. And in this situation, unfortunately, I don't think that happened, but remains to be seen what the result of her federal charges will be, or if she, ends up getting convicted. But it also signals, sentences like this, when judges are handing these down, it signals to the victims, hey, if you come forward, nothing's going to happen to this person that harmed you. Or if something does happen, as far as repercussions or punishment, it's going to be just a slap on the wrist. And that's the wrong message. We don't want to be sending that to our kids. And we should be holding these predators accountable and encouraging our kids to speak the truth if someone's hurting them or making them feel uncomfortable. And that a sentence like this does the opposite.
I feel like on the outside, there's much more awareness today than maybe 10, 15 years ago with the concept of grooming and what that is. And yet you still see some of these sentences, like in her state case, where she groomed this child and yet is not really held to a punishment that many people would say, it's, the DA called it a miscarriage of justice. Do you see the legal system taking of course, sexual assault may be taken seriously, but the concept of grooming and the impact that has on someone, do you see the legal system taking that seriously today?
I think it's starting to be taken more seriously than it was before, and grooming is oftentimes something that's not recognized until it's too late. Youth serving organizations, camps, schools, churches, youth groups, they're perfect for child predators to gain access and groom children. They have opportunities to isolate them. They have opportunities to manipulate situations like Whiteside did here in her role with the church. A predator spends time slowly grooming their victim, and they gain the trust of the victim, the family's trust. They pay special attention. They often appear as a mentor. And, unfortunately, 1 in 10 kids are subject to this type of behavior, boundary crossing behavior. And that's, 50 million students enrolled in our country, in our schools, in our country right now. And recognizing the signs of grooming and educating teachers, educating students and parents about this is extremely important. Lots of behavior could include text messaging, social media access, asking a child to keep secrets, creating a dynamic where the child feels like he or she would disappoint the predator or the abuser. You know, recognizing these signs before it starts and it actually gets to abuse is one of the most important things we can do. And I do think that that's something that our society could use more education on right now.
She was at one point, since she had graduated college, she was a high school basketball coach, and then she was the leader of this youth group at a church. And this is not a criticism of faith or people who have, are very much into their faith, but we do see cases where it might be a minister, preacher, priest, in this case, a youth group leader, people in religious groups taking advantage of people. And in this case, she was taking advantage of a young person in a youth group. What is it about that dynamic where a child can be vulnerable to someone, especially in some of these faith groups like we have here?
Sure. Parents, we all want to be confident that when we entrust our children to a pastor, especially, and a youth-serving organization generally, that our kids are going to be safe and that these people have our child's best interest at heart. And, these youth-serving organizations, youth groups, they give the predator access to kids. And that's exactly what child abusers look for. They look for opportunities. And an opportunity to abuse a child, this is exactly it. You have a situation where this adult is constantly around a group of children, and he or she can manipulate the situation to make sure that the child sits next to them on the bus or has a room at camp next to them or, heaven forbid, sleeps in the same bed as them. And this is just, unfortunately, an environment where these predators are also they're very good at what they do, and they do it on a very slow and methodical basis. And so having that access and also being able to, unfortunately, wield God or your spirituality with that adds an extra layer of manipulation and, honestly, trauma to the child too, because that's not something that should be wielded as a sword against a child or anybody for that matter.
Yeah, and the DeSoto County DA in Mississippi, it stood out to me when he said that she used the gospel as a weapon. That was a pretty profound statement. Lindsey Whiteside now facing these federal charges, and it seems like a lot of it has to do with the fact that she crossed state lines, allegedly, in that case where, can you just walk us through, I guess, what's the bar for it to become a federal crime in a case like this? I mean, she lived in northern Mississippi, not far from the Tennessee border, and I believe she's also accused of crossing over into Alabama as well. Like, if someone is sexually abusing a child in Mississippi and then maybe takes that child to Memphis and the abuse happens there, is that suddenly enough for it to be a federal crime like what we're seeing here?
Yeah, typically, I would say that, yes, if you have a child, you're bringing them across state lines with the intent to sexually abuse them, and, say they obviously were living in Mississippi, travel across state lines to Tennessee or Alabama, and that intent is there to sexually abuse the child, I have to have confidence in federal law enforcement that they have the necessary evidence to actually meet that bar and actually get a conviction from her. This is an appropriate charge. A charge is, because I believe there's enticement of a minor and coercion as well. And based on what I understand that's been made public on the evidence, including tens of thousands of text messages and correspondence between Whiteside and the victim, there's probably some evidence there that shows the coercion, that shows that enticement. And it's been a great collaborative effort from the DA, from the Sheriff's Department to bring these charges and bring this evidence to federal law enforcement, because clearly the punishment in the state action, the felony sexual battery, was not something that was successful. And so, it remains to be seen whether or not she'll be convicted, but I certainly hope that if a conviction is obtained, that the federal judge in this case is not as lenient as the circuit court judge was in her sentence.
And lastly, because there's been so much public outrage because of her sentence in state court, and you've even had people recant in the state case who had written letters of support for her, they're now saying, actually, I thought she was innocent, but then once I saw she pleaded guilty, I'm sorry I wrote this letter. Could any of that play into the federal case? And if she's found guilty, a judge maybe being aware that there was this outrage in that case, and that might influence the type of sentence she would receive in another court?
I certainly think that any federal judge that presides over her case would be aware of this, and I hope that this doesn't actually influence that judge to the point where he or she would take that into like a full consideration. A judge needs to be impartial, look at the evidence that's presented, look at the crimes that were committed, and sentence accordingly. And so people can write letters of support, people can say how great of a person this predator was, and this is something we often hear, right? This isn't somebody that people thought would be a child predator, and that's exactly most situations. You have a pastor, a trusted adult, a coach, a teacher. Nobody wants to believe that. Nobody thinks that that person is capable of this heinous behavior. So would it play into it? Maybe. But I'm hoping that this judge is a little bit different than the other judge and will actually look at the actual facts and take into consideration this was a horrible crime against a child and sentence her accordingly should she get convicted.
And we'll see how this case will play out. She's slated to go on trial February of next year. Stacey Benson, thank you for taking the time to be with us on Law and Crime. I know this is a difficult story. We really appreciate what you have to say about it.
Sure, thank you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.